Hello and welcome back to another episode of On the Beaten Track. I'm your host, Rihanna. In a previous episode, before we spoke through the education and just setting the context for what is coming up, we witnessed the moment when South African workers discovered their collective power, which was the Durban Uprisings. Those strikes did not overthrow apartheid, but they changed the emotional climate of the country. They showed that authority could be challenged and that the system, though powerful, was not immovable. In 1974, the tremors had traveled far beyond industrial centers, in townships, in homes, in classrooms, most of all in the minds of young people who had grown up knowing only apartheid. Basically was me at some stage. They were too young to vote, if they were given a vote, too young to organize legally, and too young to be taken seriously, but not too young to observe. This is the story of what happened between those labor shocks and the morning of the 16th of June 1976, and how a generation moved from frustration to coordination, from private anger to public action. I really wanted to explore what was happening pre the march and really look at what were those influencing factors besides the uprising in Durban and the halo effect it had on the subconscious and the conscious mind of oppressed South Africans at that stage. And there were two major events, which we will go into. In the early 1970s, Mozambican mine workers crossed daily into South Africa. Radios drifted between languages. Borders were legal inventions. History traveled more freely. When Portugal's dictatorship fell in April 1974, the tremor ran quickly through southern Africa. In Mozambique, the liberation movement, Frelimo, hope that's the way you say it, but it stands for the Front for the Liberation of Mozambique. And that moved toward power after a decade of guerrilla war. In Soweto, students listened. Mozambique was not distant. It was a neighbor. Families were connected across the frontier. The collapse of Portuguese rule did not feel theoretical. It felt near. On the 7th of September 1974, news spread that Frelimo would assume control in an interim arrangement ahead of formal independence. In Soweto, students organized solidarity marches. They carried no weapons. They carried hope. One former participant later recalled, "We were celebrating Mozambique's freedom. We felt that if they could win, we could also win." Police did not treat it as a celebration. Crowds were dispersed and arrests followed. A student detained during those demonstrations later reflected, "That was when we realized even supporting someone else's freedom was a threat to the government." On the 25th of June 1975, Mozambique formally became independent under President Samora Machel. For Black South African youth, the symbolism was profound. A Black-led government now ruled directly across the border. Years later, Murphy Marobe would tell the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, "The victories in Mozambique and Angola inspired us. They showed us that change was possible." Mozambique did not cause the Soweto uprising, but it shifted the imagination of what history would or could allow. The psychological map of the region had changed. The pro-Frelimo marches accomplished several things, often unintentionally. They normalized protest. Many participants experienced mass political mobilization for the first time. They learned how crowds moved, how slogans unify, and how authority responds to it. They built networks. Students from different schools encountered each other. Contacts forms that would later facilitate coordination in 1976. They expanded political imagination. Freedom was no longer theoretical. It was a nearby address. They addressed the limits of the state's tolerance. Peaceful solidarity could still provoke repression. This shaped expectations for future protests. Looking back, historians often describe the pro-Frelimo marches as a precursor to the Soweto uprising. If you watch the YouTube video that I've pasted in the show notes, where one of the organizers, which is speaking to one of the organizers of the 1976 march, she does actually point to this as one of the precursors to set context. So it wasn't because, like I said, that they caused it directly, but it's because they revealed a crucial truth. Young people were willing to mobilize and capable of doing so. They had marched once, they could march again. If Mozambique represented possibility, Angola represented confrontation. As Portuguese power collapsed in 1974, Angola descended into a struggle between liberation movements. The MPLA, People's Movement for the Liberation of Angola, appeared poised to take control in Luanda. The apartheid government saw something else: encirclement. A Marxist-aligned government in Angola, alongside a newly independent Mozambique, would leave white minority South Africa increasingly isolated. In October 1975, the South African Defence Force launched Operation Savannah, sending troops thousands of kilometers into Angola. The invasion was initially covert, but rumors moved faster than official statements. White reservists disappeared from jobs. Military convoys were whispered about. The war filtered back through censored newspapers and quiet conversations. Cuban forces soon entered the conflict in support of the MPLA. The Cold War had arrived in southern Africa. By early 1976, South African forces withdrew. It was not publicly framed as defeat, but it was not a victory. For township youth, two lessons crystallized. The apartheid state was afraid, and white military power could be challenged. Years later, political analyst and former activist Ronnie Kastrols observed, Angola was a turning point. It showed that South Africa's military could be pushed back. For young people in Soweto, watching from classrooms, the message was simpler. The region was changing, and the government was tightening. Militarization abroad was mirrored by intensified policing at home. Security became the justification for everything. While Mozambique celebrated and Angola burned, Soweto remained structurally confined. Townships were not accidents. They were engineered labor reservoirs, urban holding zones for black workers whose economic productivity was needed but whose political presence was denied. Houses were overcrowded, electricity was inconsistent, schools were underfunded. By the mid-1970s, nearly half of South Africa's black population was under 20. It was youth-heavy country, but youth had no political voice. Schools became the primary spaces where thousands gathered daily. The state intended control. Instead, it built connection. By 1975, the children of Soweto had witnessed something their parents' generation had rarely seen: white rule collapsing nearby, Mozambique and Angola, crowds defying authority at home, police struggling to contain mass mobilization. They returned to overcrowded classrooms, carrying that knowledge. Education had become a daily frustration. The region had become a source of inspiration. And the idea that students themselves might act was no longer unthinkable. The stage was set, not yet for the uprising, but for the organization. Urban townships were expanding rapidly during the mid-1970s. Forced removals and rural poverty pushed families into cities, but infrastructure did not keep pace. Living conditions deteriorated. We had overcrowded homes, limited sanitation, inadequate electricity, scarce recreational spaces, and constant surveillance. I must say, looking at South Africa today, in these big urban cities, minus the constant surveillance, probably have the same problems today. So young people grew up surrounded by evidence of equality. They saw parents commuting long distances for low wages. They saw police vans patrolling residential areas. They saw opportunities narrowing rather than expanding, and childhood unfolded under constraint. Many of these young people carried adult responsibilities very early. They were caring for their siblings, managing household duties, navigating unsafe environments. Some of them, at very young ages, were holding down a job after school. So schools became the primary space where a large number of youths gathered daily. Ironically, the state had created its own future opposition infrastructure. Classrooms brought together hundreds of students who could compare experiences, share frustrations, and form networks. Information spread rapidly, faster than official channels could monitor. A complaint that one school had became common knowledge across an entire township within days. So just think about all this information spreading without technology and how eventually coordination happened. It's amazing. Just a recap of what we spoke about in the education episodes. We're looking at schools that were overcrowded. Classrooms had more than 50 students in them. Some of them didn't even happen in buildings because they were too small or not resourced or not available. So some of them happened outside. Textbooks were scarce and shared one textbook among 7 students. Like I said, facilities were deteriorated. Teachers' shortages were severe. Education was really there to create a disciplined workforce, not critical thinking. Yet by creating this education system, they exposed these students to knowledge, which then created awareness. Students learn about geography, world events, and political changes, even as their futures were constrained. The contradiction was stark. They were educated enough to recognize injustice, but not empowered to escape it. Then, in 1974, the government mandated that key subjects in Black secondary schools be taught in Afrikaans. Administratively, it was a policy change. Practically, destabilized the classroom. Many teachers lacked proficiency in Afrikaans. Many students struggled to comprehend lessons. Academic performance declined. Frustrations grew on both sides of the classroom. The language issue carried symbolic weight as well. Being forced to learn complex subjects in this language felt less like education and more like imposition or humiliation. Resistance began quietly. Students refused to respond in Afrikaans. Teachers petitioned authorities, and passive disruption of lessons occurred. When complaints produced little change, frustrations hardened into determination. By 1975, Soweto students had already marched once in solidarity with Mozambique. They had already seen police respond with force. They had already learned that mass mobilization was possible. Friendships, church groups, and sports clubs formed informal communication networks between schools. Communication across schools developed organically. Students compared experiences. Our teachers cannot teach properly. We are punished for not understanding, and this is happening at our school too. After school meetings began, initially small, then larger. Murphy Marobe later reflected, it was not spontaneous. There was discussion. There was organization. These gatherings debated possible responses: boycott or march, petition or demonstrate. They understood risk. Detention without trial was common. One former activist recalled, we were afraid, but we were more afraid of accepting it. Contrary to later portrayals, these discussions were not reckless. Students weighed risk carefully. They knew the state could detain, expel, or punish them, but doing nothing felt increasingly intolerable. Between 1974 and early 1976, four forces converged: regional liberation victories, visible military anxiety within the apartheid state, educational degradation, and the growing youth coordination. Mozambique had shown that colonial rule could end. Angola had shown that South Africa could be challenged, and they were nervous, the government. The Afrikaans decree made injustice intimate, and township networks made action possible. By June 1976, the idea of a march no longer felt unimaginable. It felt necessary. The generation had been watching history unfold across borders. Now they would step into it. Every movement eventually produces individuals who move from participation to coordination. In Soweto, several students assumed that role. Three would later become especially prominent: Tsitsi Mashanini, disciplined, deliberate, calm; Sibungele Mkabela, a communicator, connector; Murphy Marobe, strategic, reflective. Their leadership did not emerge from titles or age. It emerged from necessity. Tsitsi was a student at Morris Isaacson High School. He was known for calm deliberation. He was not flamboyant, not impulsive, but he possessed credibility among peers. He emphasized discipline as the key to legitimacy. If students demonstrated organization and restraint, their grievances would be harder to dismiss as mere disorder. He helped coordinate discussions across multiple schools, transforming scattered frustration into collective planning. Mashanini emphasized order. He insisted the march must be peaceful. As he told the BBC in 1996, "We were not Tsotsis, we were students." Sibungele played a crucial communication role. She moved between groups, relaying information, ensuring meetings were attended, and maintaining cohesion across different schools. Movements often depended on such figures, individuals who build networks rather than seek visibility. Her work demonstrated that young women were central to organization, not peripheral participants. Murphy Marobe contributed to the structural side of mobilization. He would later say, "We believe that if we showed unity and discipline, the government would have to listen." Younger but deeply engaged, he absorbed lessons about coordination, discipline, and long-term strategy. His later prominence would reflect the formative impact of this period. In 1976, however, he was one of many students confronting immediate realities rather than future careers. There was idealism in that belief. There was also calculation. They expected arrests. The choice to organize a mass demonstration did not stem from a single event. It emerged from accumulated pressure, which included educational disruption, ignored complaints, growing youth solidarity, and a sense of urgency. Students believed a unified, peaceful protest could force authorities to acknowledge their grievances. Planning intensified in early June 1976. Key principles were established: peaceful conduct, no weapons, centralized gathering, student marshals will maintain order. Organizers coordinated routes and meeting points across Soweto schools. One later account emphasized, "We will organize, we had marshals, we had plans." On the 15th of June 1976, Soweto appeared ordinary. Children did homework, parents prepared meals, buses ran, radios played. But beneath the surface lay years of accumulated pressure. Organizers moved quietly through neighborhoods, confirming arrangements. Some students prepared placards in secret. Parents suspected something, but few understood the scale. One mother later told a journalist, Gail Gerhardt, "They said they were going to protest. We thought it would be like before, singing and coming home." History rarely warns you. Most believed they would return home by afternoon. Few imagined how dramatically their country would change. Morning would come and children would walk into it. Next week, we step into the morning itself. From the first students leaving their homes, to the gathering crowds, to the confrontation that would ignite an uprising. So join us when we look at the 16th of June, 1976, a day that shook South Africa and the world. Thank you so much for listening. It's always so important to understand context and what people really thought, and the government really thought that it was spontaneous, that this came out of nowhere, which is just unfathomable to me. When you put pressure and put pressure and put pressure, take away, grade, humiliate. The fact that you don't expect an opposition or protests or a word from anyone because you had indoctrinated people to believe that they were inferior is bonkers to me. How no one saw this coming, I cannot understand. But that then also speaks to the arrogance that goes when building such a regime, that you believe your own propaganda. And what do they say when you drink your own Kool-Aid? Okay. Join me next week where I will go through what happened on that day from accounts which I've gathered and put a timeline together and then speak to what was the consequences thereof. See you next week. Bye.